When a storm shatters the silence in the Blue Ridge Hills, a loyal old shepherd dog risks everything to save a wild bobcat kitten trapped beneath the ruins. But as danger and suspicion close in from all sides, Ranger faces the hardest lesson of all. True love sometimes means letting go. Would you have the courage to set someone you love free, even if it breaks your heart? Where are you watching from? If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more journeys of courage, compassion, and wild second chances. There was something about spring in the Blue Ridge foothills that made everything feel haunted. Maybe it was the way the morning mist curled around the fence posts and drifted through the hollows, or how the dew clung so stubbornly to last year's dead grass. On this particular morning, the old farm outside Buchanan, Virginia, was silent, except for the steady rhythm of rain drumming on the tin roof and the low, deliberate steps of Ranger, an adult German shepherd with a chest like a barrel and the bearing of an old soldier. Ranger's coat, streaked with mud and gray around the muzzle, glistened in the fog. His ears cut through the haze, searching for trouble as he patrolled the edge of his territory. 2 overgrown acres that used to belong to someone who cared about mowing before old age and arthritis set in. The farmhouse windows glowed dimly. Someone's radio murmured behind warped glass, and from the porch, the sharp scent of raw meat drifted from a brown grocery bag left out in the rush of returning home before the rain. It was supposed to be a peaceful morning, but Ranger had been on edge since before dawn. He'd heard it then, a faint, desperate sound that didn't belong. Not a bird, not a squirrel, something smaller, sharper. Now, drawn by a fragile chirp beneath the abandoned tool shed at the edge of the woods, he lowered his body and crept through wet brambles, paws sinking in the black earth. The shed was a relic, hunched and leaning, its boards warped from decades of neglect. Beneath the collapsed boards and tangled wire, something moved, a flash of spotted fur, the flick of a stubby tail. Ranger froze, ears forward, nostrils flaring. There, shivering and spitting softly, was a kitten unlike any he'd seen. Tufted ears, legs too long for her body, coat patterned with black rosettes. This was no house cat. The wild, wary gold of her eyes marked her as something else. A bobcat kitten, barely old enough to survive alone. She was trapped. Her hind leg, thin and shaking, was tangled in rusted wire where the rainwater pooled deeper with every minute. Each time she tried to pull free, the wire bit deeper. Ranger took in the scent, blood, fear, and wildness, and in that moment, 1,000 years of instinct pressed down on him. He could turn away and let nature take its course, but something in those eyes pulled him closer. Rainwater was rising. The kitten, Ember as she'd come to be known, let out a low, panicked chirp, her body trembling with each gasp. Ranger crouched low, his big frame filling the shadows of the shed. He bared his teeth, not in threat, but in concentration. Carefully, he pressed his muzzle to the wire, feeling its sharpness against his lips. Ember hissed, striking feebly with a tiny clawed paw, but she was too weak to land a blow. Undeterred, Ranger bit down, tugged and twisted, ignoring the taste of rust and the sting as the wire scraped his tongue. Minutes passed. The rain hammered harder, and Ember's strength began to ebb. Ranger worked faster, muscles straining, jaw clenched until, at last, the wire gave way. Ember tumbled free, sprawling in the straw and mud, leg bloody but unbroken. For a moment, neither of them moved. Only the rain made a sound, filling the air with a metallic hush. Ember's golden eyes locked onto Ranger's face. every muscle tensed. Her sides heaved as she drew a shaky breath, a wildness burning in her stare. Would she bolt into the storm, risking death for a chance at freedom? Or would she recognize in this hulking stranger the strange mercy of survival? The question hung in the air, thick as the mist. Ranger took a cautious step back, lowering his head in a gesture both submissive and inviting. He did not bark, did not whine. Instead, he waited, as still as a stone. Ember limped forward a fraction, then froze, her tail a bristled question mark behind her. There was pain in her leg, fear in her posture, but hunger too, and exhaustion, and something more, a flicker of curiosity. The world outside the shed seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the pines, a hawk called, and the clouds broke just enough for a shaft of sunlight to touch the battered roof. Rainwater pooled around Ember's paws. The scent of blood carried on the wind, promising trouble. Inside the shed, time stretched thin, balanced on the razor edge between trust and terror. Ember shifted her weight, testing her leg, and Ranger felt the pull of something ancient, a responsibility older than memory, to protect the vulnerable, even when their paths were never meant to cross. The old wooden shed, battered by storm and neglect, had become a stage for a drama as primal as any in the wild. And just as Ranger seemed ready to retreat, a new sound cut through the quiet. A low growl, not from Ember, but from the woods behind them. Trouble was never far in these hills, and both dog and kitten sensed it. The next moment would decide everything. Ember stood, torn between fight and flight, while Ranger placed himself in the muddy doorway, every sense burning, ready to shield her once more. Would Ember stay, trust the shepherd's unlikely mercy, or vanish into the dangerous wild alone? The answer hung in the mist, as fragile as a heartbeat. From that rain-soaked morning onward, the bond between Ranger and Ember was forged, not by choice but by circumstance. The mist clung to the ridges above, and the world seemed to shrink to the battered shed and its trembling, wild guest. Ranger paced circles around the yard, every sense attuned to Ember's faint chirps and the danger that pulsed just beyond the fence line. Inside, Ember lay curled on a patch of dry straw, her wounded leg tucked tight, ears swiveling with every unfamiliar sound. She was a creature made of bristle and bone, wild instincts thrumming beneath her small frame. Yet hunger gnawed at her resolve, and as the hours crept by, her strength faded further. Ranger watched her with the vigilance of a sentry, the old codes of his breed, protection, guardianship, rising up in him stronger than ever. By midday, the rain had eased to a drizzle. The farmhouse sat silent, its human occupants still asleep or gone into town, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding by the woodshed. Ranger, left to his own devices, moved swiftly, his plan formed in the steady set of his jaw. He padded up to the porch, nose twitching as he searched for the right offering. The grocery bag, left by hurried hands, brimmed with the scent of raw beef, a luxury, a risk. Glancing over his shoulder to be sure he wasn't watched, Ranger nosed open the bag and tugged free a strip of meat, cold and red and glistening. In his jaws it felt like a promise. He trotted back to the shed, heart thudding with the knowledge that this was no simple act. To feed a wild thing was to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. Ember's eyes widened as he approached, her body tensing as if expecting attack. But Ranger kept his movements slow, laying the meat down just out of her immediate reach before stepping away. He turned his body sideways, a gesture of peace, and waited. The scent of blood filled the shed, mingling with straw and old wood. For a long moment Ember hesitated, her tail lashing. Then hunger overpowered suspicion. With a ragged movement, she dragged herself forward, muzzle twitching as she tore at the meat. The sound of her chewing, at once feral and grateful, echoed in Ranger's mind. It was a pledge of guardianship, a silent vow. From this moment, her life was tangled with his. There would be no turning back. But with the scent of meat came new threats. As the afternoon waned and clouds thinned overhead, the shadows at the edge of the property grew restless. Ranger caught the low chittering of raccoons in the underbrush, drawn by the promise of food. A chorus of yips drifted from the tree line. A band of coyotes, hungry and bold, pressed closer than they dared before. Their eyes glowed faintly in the waning light, hunger making them reckless. Ranger stood sentinel at the open doorway, hackles raised, teeth bared in silent warning. Ember, emboldened by her meal, inched forward to watch, curiosity and fear warring in her gaze. The raccoons crept up first, their masked faces peering through the tangled fence, claws clicking on wet wood. A coyote's yelp rang out. Closer this time. The world outside the shed was alive with menace. Ranger braced himself, muscles coiled. He barked, low and guttural, a sound that split the hush and sent the smaller animals scattering. But the coyotes were not so easily cowed. One bold female, her fur matted and ribcage sharp, slunk forward, yellow eyes fixed on the shed. Ranger met her gaze and stepped forward, planting his paws in the mud, every inch a guardian. The coyote paused, uncertain, then slunk away into the gloom, her pack trailing behind. Inside the shed, Ember pressed herself against the straw, heart thundering. She watched the dance of shadows at the threshold, the flash of teeth, the silent language of threat and protection. Something in her shifted, a recognition, perhaps, that survival was no longer hers elbow to shoulder. As darkness fell, the property settled into uneasy quiet. Ranger returned to Ember's side, his body a warm shield against the chill that crept in with the night. The rain, now a soft patter, tapped a rhythm on the battered roof. Ember lay restless, dreams flickering behind her golden eyes, haunted by the memory of teeth and hunger. Ranger dozed lightly, ears tuned to every sound, every threat. The world had become a smaller, more dangerous place. From that night onward, nothing was the same. Ranger knew, deep in his bones, that the fragile creature he'd rescued could not survive alone. Not yet. Not with so many dangers lurking beyond the thin safety of their refuge. His role had changed. He was more than a watchful dog now. He was a bridge between two worlds, the domestic and the wild, charged with protecting a soul that could never be tamed. The first stars blinked to life over the blue ridge, cold and distant. Ember dreamed of running, of the taste of blood and the thrill of freedom. Ranger dreamed only of keeping her safe for one more night, one more day, against the dangers gathering on every side. The line had been crossed. Ranger had chosen, and now neither of them could return to the world as it was before. Dawn came late and heavy to the foothills, sunlight struggling to burn off the lingering mist that draped itself across the fields. After a night of rain and worry, the world felt momentarily calm. The battered shed, once a forgotten outbuilding, had become a fragile sanctuary. Inside, Ranger hovered near Ember, ever watchful. The little bobcat, her wound dressed only by her own tongue, and the healing balm of sleep rested curled in a circle of straw that Ranger had nudged together, one careful mouthful at a time. For a few brief hours, there was peace. Ember's breath settled into a gentle rhythm. Her chirps softened to tiny, almost contented noises. The raw meat in her belly and the shelter overhead gave her a sense of safety she hadn't known since the wild had torn her from her family. Ranger, stretched beside her, allowed his eyes to close for moments at a time, his senses still tethered to every shift of wind and distant call. But the illusion of safety was always thin in this world, and as the sun climbed higher, it burned away not just the mist, but the sense of secrecy that had protected them. Outside, muddy paw prints and the tangled scent of wild and domestic drifted along the property line, carried by the breeze and noticed by more than just animals. At the edge of the farm, neighbors gathered for their routines, checking fence posts, walking dogs, peering at the ridge with wary eyes. Whispers floated over backyards. Someone had heard a strange yowl in the night, or seen a shadow dart from shed to tree line, and then the sharp report of a truck door slamming, a detail that set every dog in the neighborhood barking. Parked just past the mailbox, with official lettering on the side, was a wildlife officer's truck. Ranger sensed the shift immediately. The hairs along his back prickled as he watched the officer climb out, boots crunching in the gravel, a clipboard tucked under one arm. The officer moved with the deliberate, steady gait of someone who'd seen plenty of trouble, eyes scanning every outbuilding, every path. There had been calls, reports of a dangerous wildcat prowling the area. The farm was now under the silent threat of human curiosity and law. Inside the shed, Ember's recovery stalled. She nuzzled into the straw, licking her wounded leg, but the distant sounds, car doors, voices, set her nerves alight. Above them, danger circled in a different form. A broad-winged hawk, drawn by the smell of blood and movement, rode the updrafts, its shadow gliding over the grass. Ember, still clumsy and aching, was an easy target, her young body not yet skilled at hiding or fleeing with speed. Ranger's protective instincts sharpened. He scanned the shed for new hiding spots, urged Ember to stay low, and pressed his body into the straw as if willing her to disappear beneath his bulk. But Ember was wild at her core. Restlessness and fear made her want to bolt, every instinct screaming to run, to vanish. The urge was so strong she almost limped from the shed before Ranger blocked her way, his presence an anchor that kept her grounded. The world beyond the walls pressed in. The officer walked the fence line, pausing to peer into the gloom of the shed. A neighbor called out, recounting stories of barn cats snatched by something bigger and meaner. And above, the hawk circled lower, its cry cutting through the hush, a sound that seemed to echo inside Ember's bones. With every hour, Ranger felt the boundaries of their safety erode. The straw nest, once a safe haven, became a trap, its scent and scraps of fur marking Ember's presence to any who bothered to look closely. Rain from the night before had softened the ground, and muddy paw prints snaked from the porch to the shed, an undeniable trail leading back to Ranger's own tracks. Late in the morning, the officer approached the shed at last, flashlight beam darting through the cracks. Ranger tensed, every muscle locked, heart hammering against his ribs. Ember shrank into the shadows, eyes wide, sides heaving with each silent breath. The beam passed over them, pausing for a split second on a glint of golden fur. But Ranger held still, refusing to move, his body shielding Ember's from direct view. When the officer left, suspicion lingered. The threat of discovery was now real, as tangible as the mud drying on the shed's floor. Ember, exhausted from fear, pressed herself close to Ranger, her fierce golden eyes dimmed by the burden of being hunted. The world outside held nothing but new dangers, and even the sanctuary of the shed felt like it might crumble at any moment. False peace had given way to a new crisis. Now, Ranger knew, hiding Ember would become a race against the rising tide of suspicion and the predatory gaze of creatures both wild and human. Each day was a battle against time, and survival hung on the thinnest of threads. The sky darkened again by late afternoon, thick clouds swallowing the sun, as if the world itself felt the tension brewing below. The wind, cold and insistent, whipped down from the blue ridge, battering the old shed until the boards groaned and the loose tin roof rattled like distant thunder. For Ranger, every gust felt like a warning. He paced restlessly near Ember, his body taut with unease, eyes darting from the doorway to the shadowy corners where the straw nest lay hidden. Ember, her strength just beginning to return, now faced a different enemy. The wound on her leg had stiffened, making movement awkward, but her wild instincts refused to let her rest. She sniffed the air, storm and wet earth, the faint copper tang of her own blood, and the sharp animal musk of Ranger, who hovered as both guardian and jailer. Outside, the scent of raccoon lingered, but something else too, the metallic bite of trouble carried on the wind. The storm struck suddenly. Wind howled down the ridge, slamming against the shed until the ancient nails shrieked in protest. Rain fell sideways, pelting the roof and walls, and the ground outside turned to a churning sea of mud. Ranger pressed closer to Ember, shielding her small, spotted body with his own. The tin roof flapped wildly, and with a tearing scream, a sheet of it peeled away, exposing the straw nest to the pounding rain. Water gushed inside, pooling and rising fast. Panic swept through Ember. She bolted, limping awkwardly, claws scrabbling for purchase on the slippery wood. With nowhere else to go, she scrambled up a low beam, desperate to escape the flood rising beneath her. But the wood was slick, her leg weak, and the wild shriek of wind drowned out her soft chirps of fear. Ranger reacted without hesitation. He wedged his massive body beneath the beam, bracing himself against the surge of cold water. Rain hammered his back, but he focused only on Ember, his eyes locked on her trembling form. With the strength and steadiness of an old tree, he nudged her gently with his nose, coaxing her down from the beam, guiding her toward a patch of dry straw he had managed to pile against the sheltered back wall. Ember slipped. Her paws lost purchase, her small body tumbling. But Ranger caught her, his muzzle steady and sure, pushing her safely into the straw as the flood lapped at his own legs. He stood guard as the water rose, refusing to abandon her. The shed shook under the force of the storm, but Ranger remained, a living bulwark against the chaos outside. For endless minutes, the world shrank to the frantic drum of rain, the roar of wind, and the struggle to keep Ember safe and warm. Ranger's coat was soaked through, but he barely noticed. His mind was only on Ember, her survival, her safety, her wild and precious life. Then, as if summoned by the storm, a new threat arrived. Over the gale, Ranger heard the distant roar of an engine, unmistakably a car drawing closer. Headlights cut through the gloom, sweeping wildly across the tangled yard. The vehicle slowed at the gate, gravel crunching beneath its tires, then stopped. For a moment, everything was still but the rain. Ranger's heart pounded. In the back of his mind, he knew what this meant. Humans, searching, perhaps for the wild creature hidden here. A door slammed. Footsteps sloshed through the mud, heavy and determined. Flashlights flickered in the darkness, their beams slicing through the cracks in the shed walls, illuminating slices of fur and straw. Ranger pressed Ember farther into the corner, his own body low and still, blending with the shadow. The light swept across his back, lingered for a heartbeat, then moved on. Ranger did not move a muscle, even as Ember tensed beside him. Voices echoed through the rain, distant and muffled, but growing louder. Someone called out, asking questions, searching for signs. Ranger's ears twitched, every instinct screaming to protect, to defend, to keep Ember hidden no matter the cost. He waited, breath shallow, as the beams danced dangerously close. Ember whimpered softly, her wild heart nearly breaking with fear. The flashlights lingered at the door, illuminating the chaos. The missing roof panel, the flooded floor, the swirl of muddy water, and then, mercifully, moved on. The footsteps retreated, doors slammed, and the car engine roared back to life, fading into the distance as the storm began to wane. Only then did Ranger dare to move, shifting his body away from Ember, who remained curled and shaking in the dry straw. The danger had passed, for now. But the threat lingered in every shadow, every gust of wind. The world outside had grown harsher, the boundary between safety and disaster paper-thin. The old shed, battered and broken, stood as a fragile fortress. Inside, Ranger and Ember weathered not only the storm, but the relentless eyes of those who would see them parted. The battle to protect her had grown fiercer, and Ranger knew there was no turning back. Each hour brought new threats, nature's fury, human suspicion, and the fragile peace of their hidden world seemed ever more impossible to maintain. Still, Ranger kept watch, the storm's lesson clear. To save Ember, he must face whatever came, no matter how fierce or unrelenting. The wild demanded it, and so did his heart. As the storm gave way to an uneasy calm, the battered shed once again became silent except for the distant dripping of water through the new gap in the roof. Mud pooled on the ground, soaking into Ember's fur as she lay curled in the straw, exhausted by fear and fatigue. Ranger rested beside her, his own flanks rising and falling in steady rhythm. He listened to the night beyond the broken wall, the hush of wind, the faint scuttle of raccoons far off, the mournful cry of an owl riding the currents overhead. For a fleeting moment, Ranger almost let himself believe the worst had passed. Ember's breathing was regular, her wound slowly healing, and the threat from the humans and the wild creatures alike had ebbed with the retreating storm. But as the quiet deepened, a new, heavier realization pressed in on him, stronger than the ache in his bones or the bite of cold water against his skin. This fragile calm was only a pause, a moment stolen from the inevitable. Survival for Ember meant far more than hiding. He saw it now with a clarity born of exhaustion and love. She would need more than shelter and food if she was ever to thrive. Ranger remembered his own training, years of careful discipline, commands drilled into his muscles, rituals that shaped him into a creature of obedience and watchfulness. Those instincts had saved him, and now had saved Ember. But for Ember, discipline would have to mean something different. She was wild, untamable. Her future meant for a world without fences or human hands. If he kept her here, growing too comfortable and dependent, he would be stealing that future from her, chaining her to a life she could never belong to. The ache in his heart was sharp, But it was clear, to truly protect Ember, he would have to let her learn the ways of the wild. So as the pale dawn crept across the sodden fields, Ranger began to change the rhythm of their days. No longer did he simply guard her or offer food whenever she looked weak or hungry. Instead, he started to teach her in the only ways he knew. He led her outside, just beyond the shed, into the tangled grass at the edge of the woods. He waited, patient and silent, as she limped after him, every movement cautious but determined. Ranger modeled the rituals of safety, always sniffing the air before moving, never eating until he had stepped away, and vanishing into the brush at the slightest hint of danger. He taught Ember to watch the horizon, to freeze when a door creaked open, or when human scent drifted close. When coyotes yipped in the distance or raccoons circled back at dusk, he led her to higher ground or deeper shadows. Sometimes they hid together under fallen logs or in the hollow of an old oak. Ranger's body curled protectively around hers, but always leaving space for Ember to move, to learn, to run. In the mornings, Ember's limp grew less pronounced, her body gaining strength. She stalked beetles in the weeds, pounced clumsily at crickets, and swatted at the shadows cast by passing birds. Each time she succeeded, her confidence grew. But the wildness in her eyes never faded. If anything, it deepened, burning brighter with each lesson. Ranger watched her, pride mingling with a growing sorrow. The more she learned, the more distant she became, her instincts pulling her toward a world he could never fully follow. Sometimes, Ranger returned to the porch, pausing by the grocery bag that had once offered salvation. He no longer stole meat for Ember, except when her hunger was desperate. Instead, he let her feel the pang of emptiness, the drive that would push her to hunt, to rely on her senses and her speed. He taught her patience and caution, reward and consequence. At night, while she slept curled beneath the battered shed, he kept his vigil a few paces away, no longer pressed against her side. He was always there, but less present, a shadow instead of a shield. Word spread through the valley about the mysterious animal sightings. The wildlife officer's truck appeared more frequently on the dirt road, windows glinting in the sun, the driver's eyes always scanning, always searching. But thanks to Ranger's new lessons, Ember became a ghost, her presence marked only by fleeting tracks, never by scent or sound. She learned to vanish at the first sign of trouble, slipping between roots and rocks, her coat blending with the dappled shadows. It hurt Ranger to watch her pull away, but it was a pain he bore with silent dignity. Each day, he offered Ember a little more distance, a little more trust. He was no longer just her rescuer or protector. He was the bridge to her wild life, the mentor who would let her go when the time came. The ache of coming loss grew in him, but he carried it as only an old shepherd could, proud and resolute. In the end, Ranger knew what he had to do. Love for a wild soul was not possession but preparation, a lesson learned slowly, painfully, in the shifting dawn. With each passing day, Ember's strength grew, her movements growing less tentative as the wound on her leg faded to a memory. The lessons Ranger had pressed into her bones, how to hide, when to move, what to fear, were now woven into every step. But even as Ember grew more elusive, the danger outside their makeshift haven only intensified. The world beyond the battered shed was closing in. Caleb Martin, the elderly farmer whose land bordered the woods, had watched the strange partnership unfold from afar. He'd seen the wild shape at Ranger's side, recognized the feline silhouette darting through the tall grass at dusk. Caleb's heart ached with a blend of awe and worry. He knew the valley's code well. Wild things belonged to the wild, and trouble always followed when lines were crossed. Yet he could not ignore the bond he'd witnessed, the way Ranger shepherded Ember, teaching her not just to survive, but to belong to a world that would never love her back. Caleb moved carefully. Under the guidance of Dr. Evelyn Hart, the only licensed wildlife rehabilitator within 50 miles, he devised a plan. If Ember stayed much longer, the threat of discovery, and of her being deemed too tame, would only grow. The state's officers had already driven past twice that week, the men inside armed not only with questions, but with tranquilizer rifles, ready for any wild animal labeled a risk. If Ember was caught and judged to be imprinted on humans, her fate would be sealed. Caleb would not let that happen. Late one afternoon, as thunderheads gathered again on the horizon, Caleb set out across the field with a large, humane live trap in tow. He worked in silence, hands practiced and gentle, following Dr. Hart's precise instructions. The trap was left open and unbaited at first, camouflaged with boughs and old straw, its door propped with a stick. Caleb scattered bedding inside, straw laced with Ranger's scent, a comfort Ember would recognize. Ranger sensed the change in routine at once. He sniffed the trap, circled it, then pressed his nose to Ember's fur, urging her to investigate. For hours, Ember remained wary, circling wide, nose twitching, the memory of confinement etched deep in her wild mind. Yet as night fell, curiosity drew her closer. Ranger lay nearby, his body both sentinel and guide, eyes never leaving the brush where coyotes still roamed, their hunger growing with every dusk. The air crackled with tension. All the lessons, all the patience, would soon be tested. Caleb watched from a distance, hidden by the shed's corner, his heart pounding. Every movement, every snap of a twig brought a fresh wave of dread. The trap had to work the first time. There would be no second chances if the wildlife officers arrived first. And then, as if fate itself sensed the moment, a government truck pulled onto the dirt road, its lights sweeping across the lane. Two officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp, their faces hard with authority. They carried tranquilizer rifles and a clipboard marked "Immediate Euthanization," imprinted non-releasable. It was the nightmare Caleb had feared. Inside the shed, Ember sensed the danger. She scrambled up to the rafters, her body small but fierce, hackles raised, tail bristling. Her golden eyes blazed in the half-light. The officers moved with purpose, voices sharp and impatient, scanning the shadows for any sign of the wild cat. One officer raised his rifle, ready to end what he saw as a threat. Ranger understood. He moved into the open, making himself seen. No aggression, just steady eye contact. He dropped into a submissive, downstay posture, signaling safety and calm to Ember above. The gesture was deliberate, a language the officers half recognized, and one Ember understood completely. Ember hesitated, frozen on the rafter, torn between the wild urge to run and the memory of Ranger's steady guidance. The moment stretched impossibly thin. One wrong move would mean disaster. Ranger's eyes locked with hers, silent and pleading. A final command more powerful than any words. Ember exhaled, her body trembling, and settled into a crouch, her heart slowing as she watched the officers from above. Caleb approached, voice low and steady, explaining to the officers about the live trap, the wildlife rehab plan, and the chance for a real wild future. The officers hesitated, uncertain, their trigger fingers loosening as they took in the sight of Ranger's submission and Ember's wild fear. After a tense pause, they agreed to give Caleb and the animals a chance. 1 minute, no rifles, just patience. Time seemed to stand still. The officers stepped back, rifles lowered but eyes sharp. Caleb held his breath, the air thick with possibility and threat. Ranger stayed perfectly still, every muscle burning with restraint, willing Ember to trust, to follow, to survive. In the growing dusk, surrounded by danger on every side, hope flickered, fragile, stubborn, and wild. Dusk settled like a heavy curtain over the foothills, staining the world in deep blue shadows and flickers of uncertain light. The air was tense and close, charged with the urgency of decisions that could not be delayed. Caleb stood at the edge of the battered shed, heart pounding, the officers' forms looming just beyond the muddy yard, rifles slung but never forgotten. The trap was set, the stage prepared, but nothing in this wild gamble was guaranteed. Inside, Ember balanced on the rafter, every muscle drawn taut. The threat of tranquilizer darts, the presence of humans, and the restless scent of dog and straw mixed with her own fear. Below her, Ranger waited in a pose of perfect stillness, his body lowered, tail still, every breath a message of calm. The bond between them had grown wordless, just looks and the deep current of trust earned through days of danger. Caleb knew this minute mattered more than any before. He spoke in low tones to the officers, voice steady but pleading, telling them of the wild kitten's journey and Ranger's role as guardian, not tamer. He spoke of Dr. Hart's plan for release, the proof that Ember had not lost her wildness. One officer, the younger of the two, hesitated, glancing between the rafter and the waiting trap. The older man watched the dog, uncertainty flickering behind his practiced authority. At the same moment, Ember's wild heart made its choice. She inched along the beam, claws scraping quietly, golden eyes darting from the officers to Ranger and back again. The world seemed to hold its breath. Rain pattered on the broken roof, soft and relentless. Ranger remained unmoving, projecting only patience and safety. With a final, instinctive trust, Ember leaped from the rafter, landing with a thud in the straw below. She hesitated, her body quivering, then followed Ranger's scent, weaving through the scattered bedding and the scattered hopes of the humans watching from outside. Ranger did not look back, only shifted his weight so the path to the trap remained clear. Ember approached the entrance, nostrils twitching, drawn by the familiar smells Caleb had so carefully arranged. Inside, she found the straw laced with the scent of dog and earth and wildness, a memory of safety, but also a promise of freedom. For a moment, she froze, one last moment of indecision. Then, with a slow, halting step, she entered the trap, body pressed low to the ground. Caleb, hands trembling, watched from the shadows as the trap's pressure plate depressed and the door swung shut, quiet, almost gentle, with a soft metallic click. The sound was final and yet merciful. No sharp snap, no violence. Ember was caught, alive and unharmed, wild eyes blazing through the mesh. Ranger turned his head away, not in shame or regret, but in a final act of selfless love. His gaze fixed on the trees beyond, refusing to lay claim to the life he had worked so hard to save. To the officers, it was a sign. This was no tamed animal, no pet clinging to her rescuer, but a creature of the woods, ready, finally, to claim her place beyond human hands. Relief and grief mingled in the air, heavy as the scent of storm-soaked earth. Caleb released the breath he'd been holding for what felt like years, murmuring gratitude to Dr. Hart's name, to Ranger, to every twist of luck that had let them come this far. The officers nodded, satisfied that no human line had been crossed too far, that the rules of wildness and rescue had been respected. As night deepened, Ember was carefully transferred to a waiting carrier, the officers standing aside as Caleb and Ranger watched her go. There was no struggle, no final cry. Just the soft, resigned acceptance of a wild animal sensing that this chapter of captivity was not the end, but the beginning of something both terrifying and necessary. Ranger lingered at the edge of the shed, body silhouetted against the weak light of the porch. The shed felt emptier already. The straw nest was abandoned, the mud beginning to dry. But the echo of the drama remained in every splinter and shadow. He felt a hollow in his chest where the small, spotted form had slept for so many nights. As the government truck pulled away and silence returned to the battered farm, Ranger lifted his nose to the wind, catching the last faint traces of Ember's scent. The fight was over, at least for now. The outcome, Ember's safety and her wildness intact, was a victory that tasted as much of sorrow as of triumph. In the end, Ranger remained just outside the shed, watching the dark, listening for sounds that would never return, his heart caught between loss and the pride of having done what was right. Night deepened over the farm, draping the hills and battered shed in a hush, broken only by the soft clicks of insects and the occasional call of a nightbird. The storm had passed, the officers had left, and Ember was gone, locked now in a carrier in Caleb's battered old truck, heading toward a different fate than so many wild creatures before her. But for Ranger, the world felt heavier and lonelier than ever. In the sudden quiet, the shed no longer felt like a sanctuary. The air inside seemed stale, thick with the scent of wet straw and fading wildness. Ranger lingered near the empty nest, circling it once, then lying down with a groan beside the straw where Ember's warmth still lingered. The patch of straw seemed to pulse with memory. Her quick breathing, the gentle thump of her tail against his side, her frightened eyes watching him in the half-light. Now there was only the ghost of those moments, and the ache that comes when a companion is lost. The human world went on, indifferent and unaware. Caleb drove Ember through winding back roads, far from curious neighbors and prying eyes. In the darkness, his old hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts full of the wild kitten and the shepherd left behind. He wondered if Ranger would understand, if the dog would sense that this heartbreak was the price of doing right. At the edge of the next county, under a sky flickering with stars, Caleb met Dr. Evelyn Hart outside her modest rehabilitation center. There, beneath a low red lamp and the hush of pines, Ember's carrier was gently lifted from the truck and carried inside. Dr. Hart greeted the wild-eyed kitten with practiced calm, her voice a steady thread in the hush. She'd seen countless animals arrive this way, torn from danger, hovering on the threshold between survival and surrender. For Ember, a new journey began. The days that followed were full of strange routines. Ember learned to stalk prey in a sprawling enclosure bordered by wire and brush, to climb trees with her newly healed leg, to hide at dusk and vanish from human sight whenever footsteps approached. Each skill was learned through repetition, guided by Dr. Hart's patience and the lingering lessons that Ranger had pressed into her heart. Ember grew lean and quick, her body shedding the softness of dependence for the hard muscle and restless spirit of a wild animal. She learned the scents of rabbit and vole, the subtle warning notes of the wind. Each night, she slept curled in the crook of a branch, never once seeking comfort from the humans who fed her, always glancing with suspicion at the light of their lanterns. Back at the farm, the nights stretched long and empty. Ranger still guarded the shed, refusing to leave his post even as the rain stopped and the grass began to green again. He watched the moon rise over the ridge, ears tuned to every whisper of the wind, as if some echo of Ember's chirp might return. Once he dug at the straw, nose pressing into the spot where her scent was strongest. But each time he raised his head, the yard was silent, and the loneliness cut deeper than any winter. The humans who knew the truth felt the price as well. Caleb received a formal warning for feeding wildlife, though Dr. Hart's documentation and a stack of photos proved that this was no reckless act, but a genuine rescue. The officials closed their files with gruff annoyance, but the lesson lingered. Doing right by wildness often meant carrying burdens that nobody else would see. For Ranger, the hardest part was not the loss, but the waiting. He lay at the threshold of the shed night after night, sometimes lifting his head to listen, sometimes dozing with his chin on his paws, always alert for the impossible hope that Ember might somehow find her way back. The house behind him glowed with human warmth, laughter, radio songs, the scent of supper drifting out the window. But Ranger remained outside, faithful as the stars, guarding what was left of a world he'd shared with a wild soul. As spring turned to early summer, the farm slowly returned to its rhythms. New grass grew where the mud had been, and the hills brightened under long, warm days. But for Ranger, each sunrise was marked by absence. Still, he stayed by the shed, a silent sentinel, holding vigil not just for Ember, but for the possibility that the world could be made kinder by a single act of courage. At Dr. Hart's rehab center, Ember's journey was just beginning. Her spirit had never dulled, never yielded to the easy comfort of captivity. She learned the boundaries of the enclosure, tested every fence and shadow, and waited, always waited, for the day when the world outside the wire would open to her once more. The price had been paid by all, but the hope of freedom, bought with loneliness, worry, and sacrifice, remained undimmed, burning in both their hearts like a quiet, unwavering flame. As summer unfurled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge, the world moved forward, indifferent to the losses and triumphs etched in the soil beneath the old shed. Life resumed its ordinary rhythms, cows grazing in distant pastures, crickets singing through the heat-heavy afternoons, the farmer's truck rattling along the lane with bales of hay stacked high in the bed. For most who passed by the battered shed, it was just another forgotten outbuilding, its secrets buried beneath seasons of rain and dust. But for Ranger, nothing felt ordinary. Day after day, he lingered by the shed, circling the straw nest or lying with his muzzle pressed to the earth, where Ember's scent once lingered. Though the world around him blossomed with life, Ranger felt the emptiness as a kind of weight, a hollow in his chest where memory and longing gathered with every dusk. He watched for any sign, however fleeting, that the little wild cat he had saved and loved might return. Sometimes, at sunrise, he wandered the edges of the woods, nose low, retracing the path Ember had once taken from shadow to shelter. Other times, he stood at the fence line, listening to the wind for a cry that never came. Yet in his quiet vigil, Ranger's grief softened into something more enduring, a lesson etched into his heart by loss and love. In the outside world, Ember's journey toward freedom continued. Reports filtered back to the farm from Dr. Hart's rehab center. Ember had quickly adapted to the soft release program, a careful process designed to prepare wild animals for life beyond captivity. She hunted mice and rabbits with growing skill, climbed high into the branches of the enclosure's tallest trees, and vanished instantly whenever a human footstep approached. The wildness that Ranger had worked so hard to preserve now blossomed fully within her, turning her into a creature as elusive as a shadow at dusk. The center's staff watched with satisfaction as Ember grew strong and wary, her injuries long healed, her body lean and quick. They recorded her progress, noted how she avoided people, how she preferred the deepest cover, how she watched the world with a golden, guarded gaze. In time, Ember was selected for a trial release, a monitored return to the wild, staged in the deep grass and bramble at the forest's edge, far from roads and human homes. That morning, the air was cool and rich with the scent of earth and pine needles. The staff opened the enclosure gate and stepped back, giving Ember her first true choice in months. For a long moment she hesitated, her head low, nostrils quivering, every muscle tensed. Then, in a blur of motion, she slipped through the opening, her body melting into the tall grass with barely a whisper. The forest swallowed her up, and she was gone. Yet something in Ember pulled her back, just once to the world she had known. Later that day, as dusk fell over the ridge, Ranger stood by the fence, nose raised to the changing wind. He sensed something different, a ripple of anticipation running through the fields. The grass along the tree line shivered, and, for a fleeting heartbeat, Ember emerged, her form limned by the last rays of sunlight, eyes bright and searching. She stood in the open, poised and wild, her coat glossy, her stride free of pain. Ranger did not bark, did not move. He only watched, heart pounding. For a breathless moment their eyes met, silent recognition passing between them. A memory, a promise. There was no need for words. In that single look, everything was understood. The love that had saved her, the courage that had set her free, and the final, hardest lesson, that to truly love a wild soul was to let it go, even when your own heart begged you to hold on. Then, just as quickly, Ember turned and vanished into the shadows, her movement as fluid and untamed as the wind. She did not look back. For Ranger, the ache of parting remained, but it was no longer sharp. Instead, it settled into a quiet pride, a sense of rightness that only grew as the days passed. He knew now that his purpose had never been to keep Ember, but to prepare her for a world that could never be his. The emptiness in the shed no longer felt like loss, but like a gift he had given. A gift measured not by what he had kept, but by what he had released. Around him, the community changed in small but meaningful ways. News of the wildcat's rescue and successful release spread, and neighbors who had once whispered in suspicion now spoke of compassion and respect. Parents taught their children to watch for signs of wild animals, to respect boundaries, to understand that the world was richer for the wildness it still held. Ranger became something of a legend, the shepherd who had bridged two worlds with patience and courage. In the end, the lesson remained: quiet, profound, and enduring. True connection, Ranger understood, was not about possession, but about trust and sacrifice. To love a wild soul meant being willing to let it go, to stand as a guardian on the threshold between worlds, and to find peace in knowing you had done what was right, even when it broke your heart. As twilight deepened, Ranger lay once more before the empty shed, ears tuned to the night. Somewhere out there, in the tangled wild, Ember ran free, her spirit shaped by the lessons of love and loss, as untamable as the mountains themselves. Seasons turned in slow, golden revolutions over the Blue Ridge, each day bringing subtle changes to the old farm and its hills. The battered shed weathered sun and storm, its timbers grayed and bowed but still standing, a quiet testament to all that had unfolded within its shadows. Ranger grew a little older, his muzzle whitening, his gait more measured, but the fire in his eyes never dimmed. The rhythm of the land, once punctuated by crisis and fear, eased back into its ancient, steady groove. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the fabric of the valley, woven not just by one wild cat's journey, but by the choices made by those who watched and cared. The farm and its edges became a silent classroom, where lessons of compassion and restraint took root. Neighbors remembered the chaos of those stormy weeks, the searchlights and worried voices, but with time suspicion gave way to pride. A shared story of rescue and release, retold at kitchen tables and fence lines. Caleb, too, carried the memory close, tending his fields with a keener awareness of the life unfolding just beyond the pasture. He kept a careful eye on the woods, respecting the boundaries that wild creatures demanded, and was quick to share what he'd learned with any neighbor willing to listen. Dr. Hart's reputation as a steward of the wild grew, her work rippling outward into new policies and community meetings, efforts aimed at shaping a future where people and wildlife could coexist, not just endure each other. But it was Ranger who embodied this shift most visibly. The locals took to calling him the guardian of the wild, a living symbol of a new respect. Children, once quick to chase or startle, now watched quietly from a distance, learning to notice animal tracks in the mud, to listen for birdsong and the quick flick of a wild tail. Ranger's patience, his willingness to give space and guide without possession, became a model for all who paid attention. Life did not become easier. Foxes still raided henhouses, and storms still battered the hills. But there was a growing sense of harmony. A fox would pass beneath the fence and slip away with only a warning bark from Ranger, not a chase. Deer grazed closer, the old dog's presence seen as a boundary, not a threat. The line between wild and domestic, once sharply drawn, blurred into something more nuanced and hopeful. Meanwhile, Ember thrived in the freedom that had cost so much. Months passed, and her story faded from daily conversation, but not from the hearts of those who knew. Occasionally, news would travel through the valley, a glimpse of a young bobcat crossing a creek at dawn, a flash of golden eyes in the thicket above the orchard. No one claimed her, but everyone hoped. Each rumor was met with a knowing glance in Ranger's direction, a silent celebration of what it meant to love without owning. On one unforgettable morning, long after Ember's release, a pair of wildlife researchers setting camera traps for a regional survey found a string of clear, fresh prints on the trail. A bobcat's, nearly grown, moving confidently through her native range. The images later confirmed what the heart already knew. Ember had survived, grown strong, and kept her distance from people. She was seen stalking through dew-laden grass, her coat thick and healthy, vanishing at the first sign of humans. There was no collar, no tag. Nothing to mark her but the fierce intelligence in her eyes and the untamed grace of her stride. Ranger, too, found a new rhythm. He still visited the old shed at dusk, lying quietly before the doorway, not with longing, but with a deep, enduring peace. The pain of parting had faded, replaced by pride and contentment. He had done what so few are willing to do. He had let go, trusting that the love he had given would echo outwards, shaping not just Ember's future, but the future of all wild souls that passed through these hills. And in the way of stories that matter, this one did not end with a single act or a simple lesson. Instead, it became part of the valley's spirit, a shared memory that gently challenged each person to ask, if I found myself in Ranger's place, would I have the strength to protect, to nurture, and when the time came, to release a wild creature I had come to love? So the question lingered, an invitation carried on the wind through fields and forests alike. What kind of guardian will you be when faced with the wildness that crosses your path? Will you choose fear, or will you choose compassion, letting your heart be both strong and gentle enough to set something free? As dusk painted the mountains in violet and gold, Ranger rose from the shed one last time, nose to the breeze, ears flicked forward. Somewhere, far off, a bobcat called, a brief, wild sound full of promise and mystery. Ranger listened, heart full and unburdened, content at last to watch over his patch of earth, knowing he had helped build a bridge between two worlds. In the end, the story became a call to community, a reminder that the smallest acts of understanding and bravery can ripple outward, changing not just one life, but the world that holds it.